Hello, my name is Owen, and welcome to 3 Ways to Be a Better Reader. This isn't going to be a revolutionary list, guys. It's going to be the fundamentals, because you know what? Sometimes the fundamentals are forgotten. And it's time for me to remind you. I had this idea because I recently did my best books of the first half of 2024 video, and looking at that list, I had a couple good books. I didn't have a lot of great books. And you could blame the works, you could blame the authors, but at the end of the day, I'm the one picking them. Am I right? So I was just thinking about ways that I can improve that in the second half of 2024. And I just got to thinking in general, what are ways I could be a better reader overall, right? And I think this advice, I could apply it to myself and I could apply it to perhaps everyone, because like I said, they're the fundamentals. So starting with the first one, it's super obvious, guys. You got to find the right book. Where's my Nobel Peace Prize, right? Find the right book, really? But it is important, and there is a little bit of nuance to it as well, because there's a difference between, I think maybe the strategy is the right word for finding the right book for a reader and finding the right book for a non-reader, because these are people who are wired very, very differently. And starting with readers, I feel like for the most part are stubborn to a fault. Right? We have a TBR list a mile long. We start a book, and even if it's boring and we hate it, we'll finish it, right? But I think that, one of the most important resources in our life is time. So the biggest thing for this number one, is we cannot be afraid to put down a book and DNF it, right? To not finish it. I don't know if it's just some part of our brain where we think it's disrespectful to ourselves or disrespectful to the author that we don't finish a book, but there's not enough time in the world, and we have too many books on our list to be reading something that we're not fully enjoying. And I'm a proponent of giving a book a chance, giving it 50 pages perhaps. Any more than that, if you're really not liking a book, there should be no shame in putting it down and saying, it just wasn't for me. Because there is an infinite amount of books out there, or a seemingly infinite amount of books. There's not really an infinite amount of books. But there's so many books out there that if you put that one down and picked up another one, in the grand scheme of things, it would have only benefited you. There's no harm in putting a book down, no matter how great people say it is. If you don't like it, you don't like it, and that's completely fine. It's not like TV shows, right, where there's like a lot lesser amount, and there's people talking about it, like, what do you mean you haven't seen Breaking Bad? I mean, even if that was the case, you just like, yeah, I didn't, and then you move on with your life. I have seen Breaking Bad, okay? You don't need to comment that. But for books in general, there's so many of them. If you haven't read a specific book, it's completely fine. Completely fine. But that being said, talking about TBRs in general, readers need to be more flexible. And this is really referring to myself, right? As someone who has a channel, sometimes I publicly state my TBR. However, I also publicly state that I'm a known liar. I very rarely stick to my TBR, but I think that's something that I could stick to even less in some ways. Not that I'm trying to lie, trying to give you a fake list for no reason, but one of the things you have to do is really listen to yourself and what you're craving in that moment. Because if I say I want to read a book at the beginning of the month, it's true in that moment. I do want to read that book, but I got to read these other 2 books first. And that could be multiple weeks later, perhaps months later. And if you're listening to yourself and you say, well, I'm not in the mood for a fantasy. I'm not in the mood for a modern day romance at this moment. TBR should be fluid, right? And that sounds obvious as well, but I think one of the biggest problems with reading culture these days is that it's very tied to consumerism in a lot of ways, and that affects both of those points that I already mentioned. If you buy a stack of books from the bookstore, let's say it's 5 books, right? There's your TBR. It's on your shelf. It's staring at you, right? And books aren't cheap these days, unless you're getting them at the used bookstore. Books could cost anywhere from $11 to $25. If it's a special edition, maybe it's $35. I don't know what those run these days. But if you buy a physical book and you don't like it, then you have 2 choices, right? You either push through it so you're not wasting your money that you already spent and you're wasting your time instead, or you put it down and you don't finish it, and then you still feel like you wasted even more, right? So there's either way you've wasted your money because you didn't enjoy it at all. But whether or not you're wasting your time is really the decision there. And the thing, jumping over to non-readers for a minute, That's why I recommend, if you're a non-reader, the biggest thing that you need is quantity. of books read, because right now you just don't really know what your tastes are, and reading tastes are really like fingerprints, right? Everyone is slightly different. So what I recommend for a non-reader is go to the library or go to the digital library and read what's popular, and whether that be popular in the media or popular amongst your friends, just to give you a baseline. And something that's underrated, or maybe not underrated because I think people know it, but booksellers and librarians have great taste. And maybe not great taste like the books that they love or the books that you're going to love, but in the sense that they know good starting points. And even like, like places like subreddits, they know great starting points as well. Like if you like Game of Thrones, you want to get into fantasy books, there are infinite posts on Reddit about which fantasy books you should start with to get introduced to the genre. And librarians have this information, a lot of booksellers have this information, and that's what I mean by popular, not necessarily what's the bestseller at the moment, right? So that's for a non-reader, because then you don't have that issue of like the sunk cost of you spent $15 for a book just because it's the number one bestseller and everyone's talking about it, and you wasted your money. If you get it at the library and you don't like it, you can return it and get another one, and it's free. But for readers, I think maybe not that libraries are underused, but you know what, they kind of are, or at least they're portrayed that way in the media, that you have to buy all the books that you want to read, and I've really gotten away from that in the past year or so of just buying books in general, because it used to be like, well, if I always follow the thing where if I wasn't sure I was going to like it, I wouldn't buy it. But I always thought that if I did like it, I had to buy it. Or if I was going to like it, I had to buy it. Or if I read a series, then the next books from that author I had to buy physical because I wanted to keep them on my shelf. I don't know if I necessarily believe that anymore. And it makes me more flexible with the books I want to finish, the books I want to read. It changes my TBR, makes me feel like more flexible there. And that's what I talk about every month, right, is how stressed out I get by this physical pile over here. It's because I spent money on those. And if they're sitting on my shelf, they're literally just decorations, which I don't want them to be decorations. I want them to be books that I've read. So I think in general, find the right book, listen to your instincts, and it's easier to do that if you're going to the library more, if you're not having a monetary backing on these books. And what's the case for when it is right to buy a book? I don't know. If you're rich, or if you really like a specific book. But then again, if I read a book, am I going to buy it afterwards? So I don't know. I think the case is getting less and less so to buy books in general. If you're going to do it, it's got to be a purposeful decision, not just because it can't be the only reason is that you want to read the book. Does that make sense? Obviously, it's okay to buy books still, and I will still continue to do it, but you just got to be more careful sometimes, especially if you're in a reading slump. Just don't go buying things willy-nilly, because money is valuable, guys, and we got to save it. But moving on to number 2 is listen to the book. And no, I don't mean listen to audiobooks, all right, literal Larry here. What I mean is books need to be read differently from one another. Because one thing I think we forget in the grand scheme of things, like we know it in a base sense, but in a deeper sense we forget it. Books are art, guys. And an art needs to be interpreted and consumed differently, right? In the same way that, like, I think people know that movies are art because there's a lot of artistic movies out there, but TV is art, right? But you wouldn't watch a drama the same way you'd watch a sitcom, right? Like the way people watch The Office is they watch the episodes on shuffle while you're eating dinner every night. And that's not the way that people binge Breaking Bad or Game of Thrones, right? They'll usually watch those in sequential order. I don't know people who shuffle those shows. I think that's a bit strange if you do. But they're both the same art form, but they both need to be interpreted in different ways. And books do the same exact way. One thing I found, if I was reading a book that I was very, very neutral on, not bad enough that I wanted to stop reading it or felt like I was wasting my time, but for example, I recently read The Skin of Dreams. It's a translated book. It's a French author. And you know what? It was strange. It was like a lot of vignettes of this guy's life, and I didn't really understand what the themes were, what the messaging was. I really just wasn't enjoying with it. I thought I was going to get to the point where I'm just going to put it down. Again, I did spend my money on it though, so I had that pressure to keep going. But what really helped me was I was looking up, I Googled the book, I was looking at reviews, because I'm like, what is this book supposed to be good? Like, I don't understand it at all. And I came across a review from a critic who said, he was talking about like, oh, the great prose and whatever. And he said a line that this is a book best enjoyed in one sitting. And it was just one line, and it wasn't really the point of his review, but he just put it in there, and it really changed my perspective of the enjoyment. Like, it took me multiple days of trying to read it to get to the 20th page. And then after reading that single line, I'm like, well, you know what? I'm going to sit down with it. I'm going to put an hour aside, and we're going to see how far I can get. I finished the rest of the book in just 2 sittings. Now, it's not a long book. It's only 200 pages, but it took me 4 days to read 20. It took me 2 days to read 180 because I went in with the mindset of this is a piece of work that should be consumed in a single sitting, and it's short enough to do so. And I still didn't fully, I didn't fall in love with this book, but I did appreciate it more as a singular piece of art, like a short film almost, in that I consumed all of it at once, and I felt like I could see why people did enjoy it, reading in that way. And I did that also when reading the Book of the New Sun in the second book, right? Not that there was a review that said you should read it in one sitting, but I thought to myself, it's a slower, more ponderous work. I want to read it in as few of sittings as possible. I want to binge read it, I guess is what I'm saying. And when I did that, I was able to power through it, and I think I enjoyed it more than if I sat with it slowly. And on the flip side of that, I see this a lot on classic booktube. People that read a lot of classic big books, they always recommend to pace these books correctly. Like if you read War and Peace, read a chapter a day, read only a few pages a day, really sit with this work, make it become a part of your everyday life, and you'll grow to appreciate it in a way that you wouldn't if you read it in one sitting. You would miss some of the nuance if you blew through it. So that's the two completely ends of the spectrum, but find what the author recommends if they recommend a reading pace. Find what the critics are saying because it's their job to have these kinds of opinions. And I feel like nowadays you listen to people like me instead of listening to people who might have a more nuanced opinion of how you should approach a book, which is not really something that I'm a professional on, right? You'll get me for the afterthoughts, but not really how the approach of reading it is. But there are people out there that have this kind of information that and it does work. It does work to make you enjoy a book more. And that's not just for more artistic work where it's deep or you got to find the themes, stuff like that. You would read a fantasy book different than you would read a romance book. I think that fantasy books tend to be a little bit slower while romance books tend to be a little bit quicker reads. It's the same concept there. So listen to the book, listen to the pace that it's telling you. If it's a breakneck fantasy book with a lot of action, maybe the author is trying to tell you that this is a book that needs to be read quickly because the action is quick and it needs to be in the moment. But if you set the book down aside for a year, you lose the immediacy of the action, right? But if it's slow, if it's a journey, maybe take it on a journey with it, right? Maybe read 10 pages every day. I think it can enhance your reading experience, being creative with when you read and how long you read, not just what you're reading. I think it could be very important there. And then my final point, and this one I think is really important, guys. The third way to become a better reader, and not a better speaker perhaps, is to discuss, which actually would make you a better speaker. So I take my words back. To discuss your books, guys. And I think this is something that's it's one of the great benefits of BookTube, especially for me. I said before, the reason I started my channel is because I was still reading pretty much a similar amount of books as I'm reading today, maybe a little bit less, but I would finish a book, no one I knew in real life had read it, so I'd have all these thoughts, right? And not just because I had really profound things to share, but a lot of times, like you guys see my reviews, I just want to talk, and sometimes I say things that are wrong or I interpret things incorrectly, but I just had no one to say it to. I couldn't say it out loud. And I could have went to a forum and spit out my rambling thoughts, but that's not really what those are for, right? Those are for a lot of nuanced thoughts, right? Or at least so I felt at the time. But really, what this channel allowed me to do is just word vomit my thoughts out there. It let me discuss it. And I think, not saying that everyone needs to start a YouTube channel, but watching videos like this or watching reviews and reading the comments is a form of discussion, even if you're not speaking on yourself. And it's a way to enhance books that you did finish. And in my opinion, it makes them more real in a way to discuss these. Because if you think of you're watching a show like Succession, right? And that's a great show, but when it was on TV, it was coming out every week, everyone was talking about it. Everyone was week to week theorizing or saying, I can't believe Kendall did that, right? I can't believe the Roy family is this screwed up. Kendall didn't do it, right? Michael Scott didn't leave Dunder Mifflin, right? It's a show. It's not real, but we discuss it as if it's real because that's what art does to us. When it's a collective experience, it makes us all enjoy it more. Not that Succession is a worse show now. It's still a great show, but it kind of lost that urgency when not everyone's talking about it at the same time. It makes it feel more special, right? And that goes back to like the non-reader advice of find what's popular. Read a book that your friend recommends, simply for the fact that if you finish it, even if you're neutral on it, like I said, don't force yourself to finish it. But if you're neutral on it, having that discussion makes it a better book. If I read House on the Strand this year by Daphne du Maurier, extremely disappointed by it. The fact that I was able to articulate my thoughts on it makes the experience of reading that book more pleasurable, even if I didn't really enjoy the book as much, right? And there are. And going back to like the forums thing, one of the most special things, one of my favorite series is Malazan Book of the Fallen, right? It's my favorite fantasy series. And I think a major part of that is the fact that after I finished this very complicated book, which I did enjoy, there is an army of people. And in the grand scheme of things, it's a very niche series in the grand scheme. But there's an army of people who are pouring through this text. And not every book is deep enough that you can really have these forums where they're like finding themes and stuff like that. But to be able to immerse yourself in a book after you finished reading it, or immerse yourself in a community, is an extremely special thing. And that's why I never poo-poo on what's the hot fantasy romance book of the month, right? Because a lot of people say, oh, it's lower art form, it's not as deep as a Malazan or Lord of the Rings. But the fact that you can have a discussion about it is part of the value, and you can extract further value from it. You can make the moments real. It's like, oh, when Violet got her dragon for the first time, remember that? That was pretty cool. I enjoyed that scene. And you might find someone that loved that scene. You might find someone that hates that scene, and you guys can talk about it together and make it really a more collective experience. And it's harder for sure than TV because there's very rarely a book that everyone's reading at the same time. I don't even know what that book would have been, maybe like Harry Potter when that was coming out. But there are communities out there. There is BookTube, there is book clubs. You can join a book club in person, or you can go to the forums and find people on pouring through texts. People are still talking about Lord of the Rings, and there's still people that are reading Lord of the Rings for the first time. And the old people, or the older, not old people necessarily, but the old readers love to see the new readers come in to see their fresh take on it, and the new readers love to see the older readers like spewing their information. Well, did you catch this nuance? And it makes for a really special reading experience, and that's how you really know the judge of a great book, just as a side tangent, is if it has that community really backing it up. But I think those things in totality, find the right book, and by that, be flexible and follow your gut of what you want to read, and maybe spend a little bit less money on books if you're in a slump. I think there's nothing wrong with that. And then listen to the book. Each book demands to be read differently, whether that be fast or slow or annotated or just light and breezy, audiobook form on 3 times speed perhaps. There are some books that asked for that. It's because you're taking too long to get to the point and your narrator's a little bit too slow speaking. And the third point is discuss it. Find a community, whether like I said, whether you're speaking or not, just read about what people are saying about it, and you'll find that makes the reading experience deeper for you. And those things in totality, I think, make for a really enriching experience. And it enriches books that it doesn't have to be the classics, doesn't have to be the deepest work of all time, even a fluff book, as some would say it. If you do these 3 things, you'll enjoy it more, and you'll feel smarter too. Because you know what? The best thing about us readers is that we think we're smarter than everyone else, and if you do these things, you just might be. But be sure to like and subscribe if you like the video and you want to see more like it in the future. And as always, thanks for sticking around.